Well, we'll get started here. And Courtney, my coworker, Courtney Bowler, I made her co-host so she can just let people in as they come in. Because I just have a few intro slides here. So, welcome to our webinar. Um, we are going to take questions at the end. So if you have a question, just write it in the chat, and if it's directed to a specific speaker, just put their name also. But the speakers today do have kind of different topics, so I think we'll be able to discern what questions are for who. Um, all the links to the webinar and supporting materials will be posted on our website, including this webinar will be recorded and then posted on our YouTube. Let's see here. So this first webinar is the Beyond the Front Door. This will be about constructing and managing for an accessory dwelling unit on your property. So this funding came from the Stratford Regional Planning Commission, and they received $950,000 of HUD funds on behalf of all 9 regional planning commissions, in which they distributed equally to all of us to then update our individual regional plans that help guide development across the region while improving quality of life. The scope of this grant includes funding for each RPC to conduct outreach, engagement, update comprehensive regional plans, and it also helps us conduct a pilot project to implement the recently completed regional housing needs assessment, which can also be found on our website. So the first step in our pilot project was three in-person open house events, where we talked with attendees about design, construction, funding, permitting your accessory dwelling unit. And those were done in Bethlehem, Lincoln, and then the last one was done up north in Gorham. And we're following that up with this webinar series. And so if you've been tuning in prior, the last two were about financing, and then the first one was about basically planning for your ADU. And then this final one, which is constructing and managing, which is like kind of the last step. Let's see. So we'll talk about um, construction. So we'll talk about hiring and managing contractors, setting expectations and project timelines, and how to address barriers to permitting, construction delays, and community resistance. And then we'll talk about how to be a landlord. So that'll include lease agreements, fair housing, property management strategies for owners who want to rent their ADU. And then at the end, we'll have resources to organize your process. There, we have linked a really nice main ADU guide that helps kind of people. It's just a good guide. Um, all right. And then I'll just have our speakers introduce themselves real quick. I'll start with you, Jessica.
Sure, thanks. My name is Jess Stevenson. I'm one of the owners here at Kinstruct Tiny Homes. We are based out of Pembroke, New Hampshire, and we do custom stick-built small homes, so lots of accessory dwelling units.
Nice, thank you. And Samantha?
Hi, everybody. I'm Samantha Marshall. I'm the Director of Operations of AHEAD. We're an affordable housing organization primarily serving Coos, Grafton, and Carroll counties. We do affordable housing development. We own about 513 units of affordable rental housing, and we also do homeownership education, budgeting, credit counseling, as well as foreclosure default prevention counseling.
Cool, thank you, thank you. All right. So I'll just start in with some general information. So what is an ADU? People or it's known as some people call it a secondary dwelling unit. Um, Sometimes it's referred to as a garage apartment. Lots of times I hear granny flat. It could also be a basement unit in your house. It doesn't have to be detached. A carriage house, a really popular one too. I think this one is the most common one for me is the in-law suite. Um, and then a backyard cottage. So who lives in an ADU? Students, young adults can live in an ADU. older folks, going back to that in-law suite kind of, or that granny flat, right? Those older folks, first responders, so nurses, teachers, police officers, who are looking for housing, who may not be able to afford a large home yet, right? Um, and Fonzie also lived in a unit above the garage. So ADUs, just to, and I put Fonzie here because just to say that ADUs are not a new thing. They've been around for a long time, whether we called them ADUs or not, right? This is not new.
That's funny, Taylor. We did a podcast with AARP in New Hampshire, and they also noted that Fonzie lived in an ADU.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
impressed, Taylor, that you know who Fonzie is because you're pretty young.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, one of my coworkers put it on and she was like, you gotta watch the show. And so I did.
Homework.
Yeah, exactly. So why should we build ADUs? So they provide affordable units. They encourage those multi-generational families. So again, going back to that in-law suite, or for the students, or maybe young adults in your life, maybe your parents are older and you can't afford an apartment and you want to still live close to home. It's infill instead of greenfield development. So we're not developing on new parcels. ADUs go on single family parcels. And it allows our kids to stay in the region. And then it also can be an additional source of income for the household. Right? So what can you do to support ADU development? So businesses can create a unit for the local workforce. Residents can build an ADU or attend educational workshops like this one here. And then officials, so they can support local ordinances and state legislation. And then next, I'm actually going to talk about that state legislation. So ADUs are allowed in all zoning districts by right, and municipalities cannot require conditional use permits or special exceptions. So municipalities must allow one accessory dwelling unit without additional requirements. And that House Bill 577 is defined here for you. And then lastly, House Bill 577 also allowed accessory dwelling units by right in 2025, and it was revised to also then include here, you'll see here in the middle, the detached units, which means a unit that is neither within nor physically connected to the principal dwelling. So again, back to that like backyard cottage. And then I think I'll hand it over to Jess.
Okay. I think we're going to probably double up on some of the stuff that you said, Taylor, which is fine. If that's the case, I'll just
Mhm.
skim over it real quick, but we have a little bit more detail in here too, so it might be helpful for some people. So that's great. So we can go ahead.
Yeah.
Just a quick background on us. We are very much family owned. It's myself, my husband, and my brother. We started this business because when we built a ADU at our home for Mark's mom, who had been living with us for 10 years, we were kind of in that group of people looking for a multi-generational living solution, right? And so we were thinking, where's the company that does all of this? Can they handle this? Where do we start? We had so many questions. And as we were going through that process ourselves, with our backgrounds kind of put together, we figured why don't we start that company? Because this is really overwhelming, and we kind of made it through based on our skill set, but not everybody has that skill set or wants it. So, maybe we can help other people. And my brother actually, similar story. He was in the housing market looking to buy a house in 2020. We all know how that was. Still is to some extent. And after being outbid, they finally took their funds and built themselves, him and his wife, an ADU on her parents' property. So that's kind of who we are. We all have an ADU at our house. And then why are we talking about them now specifically? Like, why are we hosting this webinar today? Obviously, Taylor, as you mentioned, the law got signed last July. You should have all seen it come through on your local ballots this past March 10th when you voted. That's when kind of the opportunity for all the towns, if they hadn't done it already, through a special vote to update their zoning regs. So if you do go to your town and ask about the zoning regs, or if you're just searching for it online, make sure that you're specifically searching for that addendum because whatever's in their regs from before probably isn't matching the state law. So if you have trouble with that, just give your town a call. You can call us too. We're happy to help you. But so that's why we're talking about them right now because the laws just changed. Also, right now, you may have noticed the inventory is a little bit low. The prices are getting a little bit higher, and the rates are kind of staying steady, kind of a little bit higher, I think, than most people are comfortable with now, too, historically. So that's why we're talking about them, and they're just a really cool solution for some families. And then that one, Taylor, you mentioned that they could be attached to or detached and garage conversions, all that fun stuff. All right, so this is a lot. This slide's a lot, so I encourage you to pause it, take a picture, do whatever you need. But these are kind of when we're talking about setting expectations and common barriers and kind of just things you should know as a general homeowner looking to do this or property owner looking to do this potentially. I'm going to start down at the corner with utilities and kind of work my way around. And the reason for that is the most common question we get by far is, do I need to install a new septic system on my property if I'm building an ADU? And the answer to that is, it depends. Like any good answer for real estate, right? However, most of the time we are actually not installing a new septic system when we build an ADU. What we do have to do this is a state rule, is we have to go get a new septic design for your home and your ADU, and that design accommodates for both properties. So once that design is done, approved by the state of New Hampshire, it goes to your town, it sits with your town. Majority of the time, that's fine. That's all they need. If you as the homeowner are comfortable tying in to your existing septic, we'll figure out a way to do that. There are some scenarios where the town can step in and say, no, it's time to, replace that septic system, but that's rare. So we can talk to you, and every property is obviously very property specific. But generally speaking, you just need the septic design, and then we can figure out a way to tie into your existing system, assuming it's not in active failure or anything like that. Setbacks are an important one too. Yes, these are allowed by right. We don't need to go get any special exception or conditional use permit. However, we are going to want to make sure that where you're building is within the setbacks for your property. We don't want to be encroaching on your neighbor or triggering any kind of variance or anything like that if we don't have to be. Since these are allowed by right now, we should just be able to put them right inside the building setbacks and go ahead and get our permit there. And what that means, I know we said by right a couple times now. That means that you don't need to go sit in front of that board. A special exception or conditional use permit basically extends the time that you're taking to go and permit these. So I know a lot of people haven't gone through that process ever, but they're like, yeah, but what does that mean logistically? It means when you're going for a conditional use permit, for example, what you'll have to do is put together a package, kind of an application, submit it to your town. Usually it's a month ahead or at least a few weeks ahead of time that the certain board, say the planning board, is going to meet. So you want to make sure you get all that stuff in order, you submit it, and then you go sit in front of the board and they give you the feedback or your answer that you're looking for. So that adds sometimes 30, 45 days to your permitting process. And it's kind of a bummer. I know, Taylor, you mentioned what we're going to talk about today is the last step because it truly is the last step. There's so many steps ahead of actually building that sometimes people forget about. And that's all the pre-construction, the planning, and that's part of that pre-digging process, right? Is going through those what used to be conditional use permit, but is no longer. So because we're not going to sit in front of any boards and we're not asking for any special exceptions, there shouldn't be any neighbor pushback for you guys. This is as long as we're building within the building setbacks, there's no variance request. These are just allowed. So if we're meeting all the regulations, your neighbors are actually not even going to get notified necessarily because they're only going to get notified if you are requesting a certain variance. If we don't meet the setbacks or anything like that, and it does affect them, that's when they're going to get notified. However, this is going in your side yard or your backyard, not in the front yard. That's kind of a common question we get sometimes too. So these are going in the side yard, the backyard, or attached to your house in some capacity. So there's really we haven't seen any neighbor pushback from these yet. The size that is allowed is usually up to 950 square feet. This is majority of times people are building about 600, I would say, to 1,000 square feet is what we're seeing. Every town is a little bit different. However, with this new law, they can't require that the max size be under 750. So whatever town you live in, you can build an ADU that's at least 750 square feet, maybe probably larger. Some towns we've seen even towns up to 1,400 square feet. It just depends, which is huge, right? That's like a whole ranch, like 3-bedroom ranch house. So I don't know. This is ADUs right now are a bit of a moving target. However, since we all voted on them on March 10th, it is getting a little bit easier. There was a time there between basically July and this past month that things were a little bit up in the air, where there was no addendum solidified yet, no new zoning reg solidified yet, and so we were having to just call the town, which you will still want to do just to confirm that you know, have all your ducks in a row. These are a fantastic value add to the house. The way that Kinstruct Tiny Homes at least builds these is stick built on site, just like your regular house. So yes, we're called tiny homes, and yes, these are smaller homes, but we bring in very big equipment. We dig a very big hole. We pour all the concrete. You know, these are frost protected. We're going 4 feet down, and so it appreciates in value at the same rate as your current single family home will and does. So we're seeing National Association of Realtors, that's what NAR stands for there. They're reporting that they add on average about 25% increase in value to the home. So if we are seeing this in a multi-generational living situation, and the parents are maybe putting their funds towards building this on their child's property for themselves, they usually are happy to do that because when they're no longer here and they're long gone, their child's property is going to be worth a lot more money. So they're happy to kind of give that gift of equity, if you will. And then current and future use, Taylor, as you mentioned, like who's living in these ADUs, vast majority that we're seeing is the multi-generational living. But because the new law was passed, House Bill 577, anybody can live in them. You can rent them out. You can certainly build one and rent it out to a local community member if you want, friends, family, it doesn't matter. They're not going to regulate who lives there. They will, however, potentially regulate if you, as the property owner, live in one or the other. They typically do want to see that the homeowner is still living on site. So as far as we've seen, for the most part, you can't just, build one of these on your house and then just take off and rent out everything, the whole property. They're not really allowing that. And then pro tip, call us if you have any questions. This is very overwhelming. It's a lot of information. Call your town. This is high on everybody's radar right now. So call the towns, call the planning department, the building inspector. They're going to know what you're talking about, and they're going to want to help you work through it. So, all right, next. Then the timeline. So how long does this take? We are seeing the design take about 2 to 3 months. For us, our company is all inclusive. So the moment you have this idea to the moment you're moving your bed in to sleep in there that night, we handle everything in between. So that pre-construction design process takes 2 to 3 months at least. Permitting is going to take up to a month. It's usually a lot faster. However, during that permitting time, there could be a little bit of back and forth with the town, nothing bad. Maybe the building inspector wants some clarification on some foundation details or some framing details that are in the plans. They just want to know, make sure that we're covering all our bases and that they're understanding the project thoroughly enough before we start digging that hole in the ground. So 2 to 3 months for permitting, for design, about a month for the permit. And then the construction can take anywhere from 4 to 6 months, sometimes 7. It's very weather dependent, obviously, here in New Hampshire. Our season for building feels like it's super short this year because the weather finally broke. I feel like maybe we're in the clear. But the construction, again, I'd say just safely kind of bet on 6 months between staffing, deliveries, delays, ordering, maybe the wrong materials came in, we got to send them back. There's always something. It's a construction project. But in general, these don't take very long because they're typically under 1,000 square feet. So next. And then what will construction look like? I think this slide, I think I'm going to add more slides like this in pictures because it is really important, I think, for people to see what this looks like. When you're talking about a tiny home or an ADU, you think just something really small, right? And yes, they are smaller than the average house. However, make a big mess. And we tell people all the time it's going to get worse before it gets better. So please brace yourself. Your yard is very beautiful now. We're gonna make a big old mess. So this is just some photos from that process for us. You can see at the top where the all jobs are custom built on those 4 photos. At the top left there, that's our project manager, Corey. What they're doing there is trenching for the utilities to connect from the accessory, yeah, that one, from the accessory dwelling unit into the main home's basement. So most of the time, that's how we're pulling for the utilities for the ADU is right from the basement of your existing house. So that allows us to just core a hole right into the basement, pull those utilities out, and then your ADU is all set and everything is kind of flowing into the existing infrastructure. That's usually the path of least resistance for those. But again, every property is different, and we just gotta kind of take a look and do some feasibility for your specific property. This one, and then that bottom right photo there. Yeah, where it says Tyvek. So that, I don't know if you see Jane. She's standing next to her little tiny home there. Jane is in Concord, and we just finished that for her earlier this year. So she's all moved in, getting settled, and she was one who chose to wait. She got all her design and permitting and pre-construction homework done. And we waited for the governor to sign the bill. So that was very exciting and nerve-wracking time because as you saw on your previous slide there, it went into effect July 1st, but she didn't actually sign till July 15th. So there was a couple weeks there where we were kind of holding our breath. But Jane was very excited to do that. And as soon as the new law passed, we submitted her permit application because her ADU is actually detached from her house. So in that photo, you see a house structure already. That's actually her garage. And then you can see a little bit of a deck peeking out in the way over on the right, and that's the deck to her existing house. So there's actually a space there where they're not connected. So her AD, so she pulls into her existing garage and then she's able to go right into her ADU that she built for herself. And then the photo all the way down on the bottom left there with the blue sky, that is a 600 square foot, 1 bedroom ADU that we finished in Manchester. We actually did go through the conditional use permitting process for that one because that was built before the new law. And that one's pretty interesting when we talk about setbacks and stuff. So that fit within all the building setbacks. That's their driveway at the bottom of the photo there. The white steps on the right are actually the steps going up to the deck of the main house. And then that shed in the back corner belongs to the neighbor. So that's actually the neighbor's property there, which is kind of helpful to see to scale exactly where we can squeeze these things in. And then that bottom one on the right, in between the photo of the blue sky and Jane, that's a 1,000 square foot ADU detached, obviously, that we built in Deerfield. The main house on that property is just off to the left, just outside the frame. And so when you pull up to that house, it just looks like 2 full houses right there. They have their existing home and then they have their 1,000 square foot ADU, and that's another multi-generational living solution. So it's pretty cool to see what people do, whether it's standalone or they're attaching it to an existing structure or they're attaching it right to the back of their house, which is what we did. There's always seems to be a good solution, and it just depends on the property. So next. All right, if there's any additional questions you want to talk about, certainly let me know. I can kind of fly through some of these and just assume some questions too. These are depending on where you live, you'll know best based on your region what the rental value is going to be. But just keep in mind that these are brand new construction. So whatever the rental value is for a 2 bedroom apartment in a multifamily home that was built in 1900, the rent's going to look a little bit more for obviously a brand new two bedroom new construction home. We do not prefabricate or work with anything modular. We're not craning anything in that allows us to get into tight little spaces like Jane's backyard, where her house and her garage were right next to each other, and we squeezed in the back there and built that. I don't think we could have done that with a crane. There was wires going overhead. There was property lines real close by. So we wouldn't have been able to drop in a prefab unit in the back there. So nor would we have been able to attach a prefab unit to an existing structure, which is what we do. Probably 50% of what we do is attached to either an existing structure or the main house. So that's why we stick build on site. And quite frankly, these are small enough where, it doesn't take the guys long to frame them. They go up pretty quickly. It's kind of a fun process to watch over the course of a few days. They have this thing up and all of a sudden you have walls and a roof and window holes, and it's pretty exciting. Multiple ADUs. We get asked this often. Some towns in New Hampshire actually do allow more than one ADU per property. I'm starting to hear from people and seeing towns pop up. Dover is a great example. They do allow two ADUs per property. I'm not sure up north who or what towns or counties have any multiple ADU allowances, but just keep in mind that if there is something where you are allowed to have two ADUs, they could potentially have more restrictive rules for that second one. Like oh, see, somebody says Conway does allow two ADUs, so super cool. Um, for example, in Dover, they say, yes, you can build two, but that second one has to meet affordable housing guidelines. So you can't just go rent that for $4,000 a week as a rental, short-term rental situation. They're not going to allow you to do that. It does have to meet affordable housing. Finance options and cost, I will kind of skim over, Taylor, because I think you guys have already covered that in a previous webinar, but super exciting that there's ADU mortgages now from local banks and lots of cool programs like that. So if you have any questions, reach out to Taylor for that one. Our process is, like I said, very all-inclusive. So we're there from the moment you decide, do I want to do this or is this a good option? We kind of talk you through that. And then if you do decide it's a good option, we can take you all the way through bringing your bed, essentially. And the construction style is stick built, like we said. I'm gonna let my dog out here. And then tiny homes versus ADUs. I think this is an important one to clarify because sometimes we're called Kinstruct tiny homes. People kind of use these terms interchangeably, which is fine. But sometimes when people think about tiny homes, they think about it's on wheels, right? It's a super cute thing that they build on the trailer and it has a loft and everything. So we're not building anything on wheels. And whatever ADU laws or new zoning regulations just got passed, House Bill 577, those do not apply to anything on wheels. So totally different totally different conversation, different game. We're not talking about that. What we're talking about is small homes built on foundations, real estate. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right, and I'll hand it over to Samantha.
Taylor, great job, Jessica. That was very informative. My wheels are already turning, thinking, do I want my mom to live on my property?
Yes. I'll tell you, you know what's so interesting too? Everybody always says like, oh, I want it way back there, way back there. Like, because a lot of people have a lot of land. This is New Hampshire, which is great. That's a great option. But when you're talking about pulling utilities from one property to 100 yards away, those utilities don't like that. And you start to lose some power and some strength and things. So we do usually end up not building way far away like people want to do. But I will say even attached for our ADU at our house, it's attached to the back of my garage. We have to go downstairs, down a hallway, through the door behind the garage. Like there goes days and I don't see my mother-in-law. I ask the kids, I'm like, has anyone checked on Nana? Somebody's gonna go down. Like I have nobody seen her. It even feels so separate, even when it's attached. So it is kind of neat.
Yeah, I think it's an exciting thing. And I think the idea of having the multi-generational kind of on the same property, but separate. And I'm thinking like when you go on vacation, your mother-in-law can just like house sit and watch the cat or the dog for you. It's like,
And when
it's
she
a
goes to
win-win.
Florida for the winter, you can house sit for her.
Yeah. Oh, well, great. That was awesome. All right, so I'm going to chat a little bit about being a landlord as you're exploring the idea of getting an ADU. Taylor, you can flip the next slide if you want. So there's a lot of things to consider when you're kind of kicking around the idea of an ADU, in addition to the cost of building it and where it's going to be and all those things. But one of the biggest things is really understanding that relationship of having a tenant and being a landlord and what that might look like. There's a lot of things you want to consider and take into consideration. It can make a huge difference, like we've been talking about these multiple weeks, Taylor, with North Country Council, about the impact of ADUs having on this housing crisis, but also being able to provide housing for a friend or family. And then supplementing your income can also be fantastic. We do a lot of foreclosure work throughout the entire state. And with property taxes on the rise, it is, we're often encouraging seniors to, consider a roommate or trying to come up with other ways to supplement their income so they can maintain their home. So I think it's a great option for that. But you want to consider, do you have the time to be a landlord? Because it is going to add extra time to accepting the rent payments, maintenance, things of that sort. And then do you have the additional financial resources, which I think we've talked about in other workshops. So I won't go into too great of a detail. Taylor, next slide. So one of the biggest things is making sure that you're available in the event of an emergency or having a backup plan. So in case you do go on vacation and your tenant is in the unit and we have a bad storm and power goes out, and maybe you have a heating system that relies on electricity, what's going to happen then? Or if the pipes freeze, who are they going to call? Or if they have a plugged toilet, all those things, making sure you have that emergency plan, because emergencies do happen, especially when you're sick or unavailable. And then making sure you have the time for the extra maintenance and bookkeeping that will come to being a landlord. With one unit, it's not going to be a tremendous amount of bookkeeping, but you do want to keep good records. You want to make sure you have a good system in place, which we'll talk about in the next slide or two. But making sure that you're giving yourself that time and space for that, especially when it comes to tax time, and making sure you've got those documents so you can account for that income. Next slide. So finding the financial resources, money to build or rehab the unit if needed. Taking on that extra debt might seem really appealing for folks, thinking that they're going to be having this extra income, but it also can be increasing your costs that you may not necessarily recoup right away. So really considering, do you have the ability, do you have the equity in the home, or do you have the savings in order to take on this reconstruction or brand new build? And if you are renting it out, will the rent that you're able to charge or what you're willing to charge, is it going to even cover all the costs? Because construction is expensive now. And, rents, they do continue to go up, but some of the appeal of an ADU is we're trying to address the housing crisis. So you might think, well, I'm going to rent it really affordable and, just make enough to, pay my expenses and pay the property taxes and utilities and whatnot. But then when you really crunch the numbers, can you even rent it at an affordable rate and do that? Or are you going to have to charge a rent that's higher than what you deem affordable? You want to also consider things like your extra costs for insurances. It's on your property, so it needs to be homeowners insured by you. Your tenant could certainly have renter's insurance to protect their own property, but because it's on your property, you're going to want to make sure that you're adding that coverage. And then the extra costs for water and sewer, if it's not going to be included in the rent. If they're on your well or they're on your septic, obviously those things are going to be needed to be pumped more. You're going to be using more water. If you're on town water or sewer, obviously your water and sewer bill is going to go up with more usage. And then absolutely always continue to save and plan for the ongoing maintenance and repairs. Even if you go with Jessica's company and you get a brand new build, you still will have maintenance. Even brand new homes need maintenance. It's an investment. You want to make sure you've got the ability to keep up on it, repairs, paint, all the upgrades that will continue to happen. And especially when you have turnovers, because tenants will, wear and tear happens, and you want to make sure that it's ready for the next tenant. So you will have to replace things more if it's going to be a rental that perhaps will change more often than if it's just like your mom living there and her golden years, and she's the only person that's going to be there. Next slide. We definitely recommend getting an actual application from anybody who might be considering, for a variety of reasons. One being, you want to have all that contact information for them, right? You don't want to just say, oh yeah, I know them. They work at the grocery store. They're telling me they have a hard time finding a place to rent, and I've got this, basement unit. This is great. They'll move in. I know Linda. She's fantastic. When you really don't even know, maybe where Linda's mailing address is or her email address. So creating a formal application, you can Google it. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but just getting those basic informations from them. Definitely getting a landlord reference, even if they've only ever rented from their parents or, they've lived in the same place for 30 years. If that is not like an actual direct family member from you, definitely get a landlord reference and definitely call. Make sure that they were a decent tenant, that they don't owe any past due rent. If they're delinquent, behind, or have a collection with a previous landlord, there's certainly is a risk they might do that to you as well. Getting employment information if they're employed, knowing where they're at. And then proof of income, whether that's Social Security proof of income or actually pay stubs to demonstrate they're going to be able to afford that rent. Don't just take their word for it and say, oh yeah, I can definitely afford it, and you have no idea what they make. So you're making sure that they actually have that income to qualify for that rent that you're going to charge. Next slide. When you're looking at references, references for landlords can be really hard because oftentimes people are giving the names of their friends and family that they lived with because they cohabitate. So they can be slightly biased. So definitely consider where that reference is coming from. Is it their mom? And obviously their mom's going to be like, of course, my son's fantastic. I raised him. He's neat and he's clean and he's quiet. But mom really might want their son to get out of the house. So she's willing to say anything to get them into their new apartment. So just take that into consideration when you're checking the references. If you can talk to the previous landlord, definitely try to do that. And then I would also recommend an employment verification. If it's not a current pay stub showing that they're employed, ask them, is it okay if I call your employer just to make sure that you're employed and like you're not on any kind of temporary status where you're going to lose your job or, you're only in a probationary period that might go away in 30 days. Next slide. When you're screening the applicants, I definitely would recommend, especially if you're looking at multiple people, to really interview them and, ask those questions. They're going to be on your own property. So you want to make sure you vibe well with them and you have similar personalities. Nothing worse than having a horrible neighbor that actually lives in your home or next to you. So making sure that you've done your due diligence, you have that interview with them, have that conversation, making sure that everybody's good. If you have pets and they hate pets, is that really going to be a good fit if your dog is already going over and sniffing them every time they get out of their car, or they're going to be like kicking your cat because they hate cats and they're allergic? So having those types of questions and really interviewing them. You can ask tenants if you're able to check their credit. Just making sure that you're following the Fair Credit Reporting Act. There is a link in the PowerPoint to making sure you have permission to check that. And then, we have this beautiful thing now called Google, and you can pretty much Google anybody and really kind of get in the deep dive of what they've done. You can social media stalk them. Well, I don't recommend literally stalking anybody, but you can definitely check up and see where people are, who they are, hanging out with, things they're doing. If it looks like they're partying all the time and living life to the fullest and you're quiet and don't like any noise, they may not be a great tenant for you. Next slide. Definitely want to create a lease agreement. I recommend this even with family because nothing kills a family relationship more than money problems or disagreements about money, borrowing money, those types of things. So a lease, even if it's a family member, is really, really important. And making sure that you're choosing a lease or designing a lease that actually fits your needs. If you Google, rental lease agreements, you're going to come up with a bazillion of them off the internet. A lot of them aren't going to really be applicable to an ADU situation. They're going to be way more complicated than what you need. And really, you're just kind of making sure that it's covering the basis for both the tenant and the landlord. So is it outlining things like when the rent is going to be due, when the payment is expected? Is there a grace period? Is there a late fee? How is the rent going to be paid? What's the expectation? Is it going to be paid via check, or are you setting up a special account that they have the ability to deposit in but not withdraw? Are they going to Venmo you it? However it's going to be, have that outlined within the lease. And making sure you're communicating with that and having them understand, yes, you might be my son, you're going to live in the apartment, but this is what you're going to actually enter a lease agreement. We expect to be paid on this date. If you don't, there's going to be a late fee. There's going to be consequences. It's not just, mom's going to get mad at you and, take away your Xbox. This is an adult situation and everybody needs to enter it and agree that this is, a substantial living situation, especially if you're going to the lengths of actually creating and building out a brand new ADU. You want to make sure that whoever's living in it is taking it seriously and not taking advantage of you as well. Other things you might want to consider about putting in a lease agreement: pets, if they're allowed to have pets, guests, how long guests can stay. You might think it's great for your adult son to live in, the basement apartment, but maybe you don't want his girlfriend at some point to move into the basement apartment as well. So having that outlined in the lease and be like, no, we agreed, you can have guests, but no one else is moving in. So just having those types of things and those conversations ahead of time can kind of really help some of those difficult disagreements later on. Next slide. Other things, loud music, is there going to be a time frame? You don't want music after midnight or 10 p.m. or whatever it might be. Smoking, that's a big thing now, especially with like vaping and, New Hampshire marijuana is still illegal, but in some, if you have a medical card, it is legal. So having that outlined in the lease, are you going to allow smoking of any kind, vaping, things of that sort? Number of vehicles. So it might be a small 600 square foot space, but if 2 people are living there, it could be 2 extra cars. Are you okay with having 2 extra cars in the driveway? Or are you going to say, no, we only want 1 extra car in the driveway because we want to be able to get out and not have to pay shuffle every morning when we're trying to leave for work? And then putting also the rules for the common areas that you might be sharing. Is it a backyard or a barbecue pit, or is there a swing set, things like that? Is there an expectation of, how we're going to share those extra spaces that kind of encroach on everybody? And then outlining if businesses are allowed in the ADU is really important as well. We may not think about that necessarily, but things like daycares, home daycares, tinkering on the cars in the driveway. They may not think it's a big deal, but you may not want spilled oil all over your driveway or in your yard, or have, 15 kids every day running around your backyard for a home daycare. Next slide. You want to check with your homeowner's insurance agent to make sure that you've got adequate coverage when you're adding this ADU. You may need to increase your liability, get landlord property insurance, but definitely having that conversation with your broker ahead of time. Insurance isn't like it used to be where you just be able to call up the day you were buying a car or buying a house and get insurance instantly. It does take a little bit of time. So having those conversations ahead of time and figuring out what that extra cost is going to be, because that's obviously going to factor into the financial calculation, whether you want to take the leap for an ADU or not.
Our previous webinar actually featured the owner of the Washwick agency, which is the insurance group.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, so check out our previous webinar if you want to know more about insurance too.
Great. Next slide. So responsibilities as a landlord legally, if you are a landlord and you're entered into an agreement with someone to rent, the unit must be habitable. So that means a property without electricity, water, or heat for more than 24 hours is typically considered inhabitable. And it's your responsibility as a landlord to provide temporary housing until the issues are fixed. That means that your expense as well. So just understanding that, especially where we live, we have power outages, we have, things happen, and it may be an act of God, but as a landlord, it is still your responsibility to make sure that they provide adequate housing. Tenant rights. So a landlord, you don't have the legal right to retaliate against a tenant, even if they have no longer paid you or they're behind in rent. This is a gray area. People often think they can do the tit for tat and, they didn't pay me, so, now I can shut off their power, or, my landlord hasn't fixed my, light switch, so I'm not going to pay them. No, both parties are wrong in those situations. You're required to pay your rent as a tenant, and you're also required to pay or to provide habitable housing. So you can't, retaliate and do things like that. All evictions have to follow state law, even if it's on your own property. You have more rights as a smaller landlord, less than 4 units where you live on the property, but there are still laws that you have to follow. If you go to courts.nh.gov or New Hampshire Legal Aid, they have a variety of resources and downloads on their websites about tenant rights and landlord rights. I am not an attorney, but I would definitely recommend perusing those before you enter an agreement where you're renting your property out, so you just have a better understanding. Next slide. Definitely recommend move in and move out checklists. We actually have one we can provide to you, both of these, but keeping notes of any damages and things like that when they move in, marking them, walking the unit with the tenant, showing them all the things, show them where the dings are, show them, if there's something missing or broken, show it, mark it, you initial it, they initial it, check all the appliances. If you're having a furnished unit, noting what furnitures are in the apartment, which isn't, and then take pictures whenever possible. Have the tenant sign it at move in, and then at move out, you go right back through that initial checklist and then mark any additional damages, things that are missing, things of that sort. Obviously, there's going to be wear and tear. You have to expect that as a landlord and take that into consideration. The apartment is not going to look like it did when they moved in. Paint wears, you move something and it dings. Those are things that you just kind of have to suck it up as a landlord, but it's the big things you want to focus on. Appliances are broken or carpet is ripped up, things like that, or stained beyond repair, smoke damage. Those are the biggies. Definitely recommend whatever you're communicating with a tenant to do it in writing, because you have that proof of what was said. So send an email. Not only does it timestamp it, but you have that receipt. You can also send it read receipt via email. Verbal conversations are great, but people hear what they want to hear, and they don't always hear what you think they hear, right? So there's three sides to every story, right? Yours, mine, and the truth. So verbal conversations are great, but if you have that verbal conversation with a tenant, even if it's about something simple, follow up in writing. Be like, yeah, Joe, I told you it was no big deal. You guys can get a dog. Just make sure it's under 50 pounds and it's, got all its vaccines and up to date, and it's in a good, has a good personality, and we should be good to go. Just so they understand that you are acknowledging that and you said what you said. If you have to, this is kind of taken from a different tenant workshop, but you wouldn't probably mail it since they're living on your property. They're right there. You would be handing it to them. So email is probably the best in this type of situation with an ADU. So you have that read receipt. Next slide. There are fair housing laws, not only federal, but New Hampshire fair housing laws, basically making it illegal to discriminate against anyone with the rental, sale, or financing of housing based on someone's race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, disability, age, sexual orientation, marital status, or gender identity. And those are all encompassing, whether you have 1 unit or you have 50 units. That is all encompassing. Where it gets a little grayer is where it's your own home and your own property. So someone living in your basement, for example, if you were, a single woman and you're like, what, I'm only comfortable with a single woman renting my basement apartment, you could make that determination yourself because it's your own unit within your own home. And that's in a reasonable assumption for your own personal well-being. But saying, I am Catholic and I only want Catholics to live in my house, that could be a little bit different. You definitely would probably want to consult an attorney on that, because that might be perceived a different way. But whether you're in your home, you are protected a little bit more against, I don't want to say being able to discriminate, because we don't want anybody to discriminate, but you do have a little bit more protection since it is your own home. Next slide. Things that are exempt are owner-occupied buildings, so where they're in your own building, and as long as you own 4 units or less. When you as a landlord own more than 4, you're no longer considered like a mom and pop landlord. So even if the ADU is on your property and you have like your own unit and then you have your ADU unit, if you then own another like triplex in town where 3 apartments are in it, you're now above 4 units. So you're teetering on now being no longer considered mom and pop, and a lot of these fair housing laws and regulations are really going to apply to you. So you want to make sure that you take into consideration if adding an ADU is going to bump you over that 4 unit mark. You might want to just kind of pause and think about it. Next slide. Reasonable modifications. This is a terminology used for the disabilities community, basically allowing people with disabilities to fully enjoy and appreciate their home. Things like a flashing doorbell or putting a grab bar next to the toilet. Just reasonable things so they can utilize the unit in a way that they might need. A reasonable modification is usually not that how do I phrase this? Usually isn't going to make it be a deal breaker for most people. Sometimes, though, where it is in your home, if it's somebody who might need a full-on handicap ramp, and maybe the way the unit is constructed and your driveway is constructed, there isn't the ability for that full ramp to be there. That might be a reason where there could be some issue where things like that you might need to consider. So just thinking about those things as you're accepting applications, not to discriminate against anybody in the disabilities community, but sometimes with your own home, there might be things that you're not able to modify in order to meet the needs of those residents. Next slide. And then reasonable accommodations. These are like very bare minimum things. A service animal, right? So we can't discriminate against a legitimate service animal. A dog that performs, alerts for seizures, or their blood sugar is low, or maybe, fetches things and retrieves them for them. But then I have, me as a normal non-disabled person, I have 2 dogs that are completely useless, but they're very cute. But someone could say, no, I don't want your cute dogs because they don't really do anything other than to sit there and bark at the mailman. So a reasonable accommodation would be allowing a service animal. Modification is when they're actually changing something to the home that might cause additional expense, but usually for most of us isn't really that big of a deal breaker in hindsight. And usually whatever is being modified, the home typically can be put back to the way it was before without that much damage or repair being done. Next slide. I said it, but I'll say it again. New Hampshire Legal Aid has great resources on fair housing laws and regulations. If you're considering being a landlord, definitely take a look at those so you understand what you're getting into, because it is, it can be a lot. And next slide, I think we have a slide about, oh, yeah, let's take the slide.
I'm muted. I just wanted to thank everybody for coming to the webinar today. I think, Samantha, I have a slide after this with your contact information.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, and then Jessica, you can either put your contact information in the chat, or I'll put it on our website when we upload this information. I'll put your email in there. Here are just some resources. New Hampshire Municipal Organizational site. There's a main ADU guide. This is the guide I was talking about before. That just gives really good, like, it kind of helps you through like a step-by-step process, kind of like these webinars have done. And then again, all webinars are recorded and posted to our North Country Council YouTube page. And then this is my contact information right here. Honestly, I'm most reachable by email. I respond fastest by email. I'm not always available by phone. But yeah, reach out if you have questions about anything or you have trouble finding the webinars, just let me know and I'll lead you to that. And then I think that is it. Thank you to our speakers, Jess and Samantha, for joining us today. Thank you for my coworker, Courtney, for helping me assist. And then thanks everybody for, coming to watch our webinar, the final one.